Please pray with me. Gracious and loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts here this morning bring us closer to understanding and accepting your incredible gift of grace. Amen. So there's a story that gets told about a man who's died and standing at the pearly gates, and the angel Gabriel greets him and kind of lays out the rules for him, says, okay, so here's how it works. You need 100 points and you can get in. So he invites the guy to tell him all the good things he's done in his life, and the more good in them, the more points he gets. So the guy thinks, I got this, hands down. So he starts off and he says, okay, I was married to the same woman for 50 years, and I was faithful to her, even in my heart. And Gabriel says, okay, that's great, 3 points. And the guy goes, 3 points? That's all I get for that? And he's like, yep, 3 points. And he's like, okay, all right. I attended church all my life, supported its ministries with my money and my service. Gabriel says, okay, 1 point. And he's like, really? About this time, he's beginning to panic. And so he says, I opened a shelter for the homeless and I fed the needy all over our town. Gabriel says, okay, 2 points. At this point, he is really panicked. And he's like, 2 points? At this rate, the only way I'm going to get in is by the grace of God. And Gabriel says, come on in. If you want a basic summation of Paul's letter to the Romans, that is it. That, and I think Buechner's, the centering moment, Buechner's reflection on grace. Robin pointed out to me, not only is it my mind I miss, if you got the epistle, I neglected to say the letter to the Romans. So my apologies for that. Sometimes my brain races way faster than my fingers can type. But if you want a summation, there it is. Paul is making this argument, and you have to understand, Paul was trained in the ancient art of rhetoric. You see it a lot in his letters, and it makes it really hard to follow them sometimes. How many of you have read the whole letter? I really urge you, go home and read the whole letter. I have been reading and rereading the whole letter, and each time something new pops up for me. But he's using rhetoric, and sometimes it seems like he's kind of like chasing himself. But the bottom line is that he's laying out first how the promise was made to Israel through Abraham, and that Abraham and his descendants were made righteous through Abraham's faith, not the law, through God's promise, coupled with Abraham's faith. And now that promise is being expanded. And you have to kind of, it's hard for us. We live in this multicultural, multi-religious world. And yeah, I think it's really hard for us to discern. Paul was a devout Jew. So was Jesus, born a Jew, died a Jew. And in that, they thought that God had called them and only them, had made the promise only to them. And now suddenly, they're being asked to let that promise ripple out beyond Israel, ripple out all the way to the ends of the earth. And so Paul's kind of like trying to get his head wrapped around that and how exactly this is going to happen. And what exactly does it mean to be made righteous? I said last week that many of us have a very negative reaction to that word. How many of you, when you hear the word righteous, put the word self in front of it? And who likes self-righteous people? So what does it mean to be righteous? To be righteous literally means to be made right. To act in accord with divine or moral law. And Paul is making the argument throughout Romans that righteousness in God's sight is no longer restricted to Israel. It is rippling out to the whole world. And as I said in the epistle, the first 4 chapters of Romans are the kind of what of the gospel. The what is, this is happening. Whether you like it or not, this is happening. God's grace is being poured out on all. And then chapters 5 through 8 are the, okay, now what? What are we supposed to do? And as Buechner said it well, we're supposed to accept the gift. We cannot benefit from the gift of grace if we don't accept it. Now, I know that many of us struggle with that because some of us have friends, some of us even have relatives who belong to other faith traditions, and they are grace-filled people. Just because we say grace comes through Jesus doesn't mean it's the only way grace comes. So God's grace, here's the good news in terms of us Methodists. We love grace so much, we've dissected it and broken it down, and we have like 3 main ways of looking at grace. And the first kind of goes to what Buechner said at the very end. The first is called prevenient grace. It is God's grace at work in us before we ever believe or ever accept the gift. And in fact, for us, it's kind of like we know that's at work, and it's what's at work in us that allows us to kind of look around us and say, something's not right. Something's missing here. And to say, all right, I get it. What's missing is my faith. And so we even attribute our ability to accept the gift to God's grace. Then we have justifying grace, and that's what Paul spends a lot of time talking about. Just by accepting that gift, we get justified. We get made, as he terms it, righteous. But it doesn't stop there. If we've accepted the gift, we go on to participate in what's called sanctifying grace. And that's just simply opening ourselves to the Spirit, allowing that Spirit to be poured into us so that we grow. We grow in love of God, we grow in love of neighbor, and we grow in love of self. The good news that Paul's sharing with the church in Rome is that that gift of grace is available to all. And when we accept that gift, we get changed. I love Anne Lamott's definition of grace. She says, grace means you're in a different universe from where you had been stuck when you had absolutely no way to get there on your own. If you read the newspaper or watch the news or are even halfway aware of what's going on in the world, do you not often feel like we are just plain stuck with no way to get there? But that very first verse it hangs you up. You know, remember it? It says, we've been made righteous through God's faithfulness combined with our faith, and therefore we have peace with God. Peace? Really? Look how many wars are being waged right now with religion as the excuse. Look at the suffering that goes on in the world. And on an individual level, I can't help but think of Brene Brown, the social work researcher from Texas, who says that we are the most medicated, addicted, in-debt cohort in all of history. Peace. If these words were true, that by faith we'd be made righteous and have faith, why do we not see it? Why, when we look around, right here in this community and beyond, do we not sense that peace? Partly, I think that a life of faith does not mean no problems, and we kind of equate them. The ancient Hebrew notion of peace, the word shalom, is much deeper and richer than our word peace. Shalom is not an absence of conflict. It's living into the conflict in a righteous way. Dealing with people who disagree with us in a respectful way. Dealing with the problems in our life with some trust that God will get us through. It is not a life without any conflict. And we delude ourselves if we think that's what it means and that that's what it should look like. But when we are able to move through, and here's one place where, I don't know, maybe it's just all those years of reading the NRSV that say suffering in that passage. Did any of you pick up on that? Did you recognize that passage and go, there's something different? The CEB says problems. That we, just because we have faith, are not going to live a life without any problems. But our faith promises that in the middle of all that life entails, good health and poor health, inclusion and exclusion, love and hate, we are not left to our own resources. The Spirit is poured into us, and through that Spirit, we make it through. I asked you in the epistle to think about times in your life that you have struggled, but come out on the other side. Are there any of you who would be willing to share one of those struggles? And I asked you, who got you through? One of the problems with our worship services is we don't make enough space to tell the stories of how our faith really does sustain us. Robin, you...
Tomorrow's another day. Just have to hang in there. And I kept praying. If I hadn't had my faith, I wouldn't have made it through. But now I can use that experience and relate it to other people and other things and move on. And it's a conquest of sorts that I can use to have Jesus flow through me and share that. So.
Thanks. Anyone else brave enough to share? We're gonna practice this more because it is hard. Those are the deep places of our lives, especially struggle. And again, our worship doesn't make space for that very often. And yet, if we are really truly to be people reconciled to God and to one another, we have to learn to open ourselves to share those stories, because it's in sharing those stories, we're vulnerable. And remember what Brene Brown says about vulnerability. You can't have deep connection without vulnerability. And B, we forget that we are not alone in our struggles. So I want to reread that section from Buechner because it's just, this is one of the most beautiful things I have ever read. The grace of God means something like, here is your life. You might never have been, but you are, because the party wouldn't have been complete without you. Here is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid. I am with you. Nothing can ever separate us. It's for you I created the universe. I love you.